So, got a couple images here just to kind of motivate the discussion. So I think, a lot of when folks are thinking about working with Dagger, you're thinking, you're going to be using containers in some capacity. Either it's kind of under the hood, or, you realize as you start playing with Dagger that it's really convenient that everything is containerized because it allows you to run everything the same locally as you do in CI, and that containers are really central to the approach. And a lot of the constructs that you see and a lot of the lingo that you see is very much aligned to things you might have seen before in containers. And we all want to take advantage of Dagger to build our fabulous, CI dream home, if you will. And the beautiful thing about Dagger is, since you're using your language SDK of choice, whether it's Go or Python or Node.js, you can use all the constructs in that language, other libraries, etc. So you can really trick it out, right? So you can put in that spiral staircase you always wanted, or what have you, right? So, but to get there, a lot of us are still dealing with this, right? So you've got, you're managing containers maybe the old-fashioned way. You've got a ton of Docker files laying around. You can't just get rid of them and move on to this, dream state of the future. So we have to figure out, okay, what do we do with the Docker files that we already have today? And how could we think about moving them, either using them within Dagger or moving them to Dagger? So that's what I want to talk about a little bit today, just to give kind of a brief overview of that. All right, so I'm going to start out here with the Dockerfile reference. And for folks that have worked with Docker in the past, I'm guessing a lot of you may well have gone here trying to figure out what's the difference between a copy and an add, or the relationship between command and entry point, or one of the other myriad kind of specific things that have to do with Docker files. So first thing I'll say is there are a lot of things that will be similar concepts in Dagger and in the Dockerfile construct, but there's a lot of things that go well beyond that, and some things that are just plain different. So what I would have you do first is think of what you want to do with regard to Docker files. So do you want to keep your Docker files for now, because maybe they're important to your organization, they're the main interface that your developers or your platform team uses, or do you want to think about converting these things into actual Dagger code? Either way, we've got you covered. So in the case that you want to use your existing Docker files, it's really, really easy. And I've found in help lately that there's some folks kind of asking for this. Maybe they didn't even know that it's possible to leverage your existing Docker files. So I wanted to first kind of highlight that approach. So in any SDK you're in, you can go into the reference. So here's the reference for the Go SDK, for example. And it turns out there's two different ways to build from an existing Docker file. So I'm going to put in build here and search for build that is under container. So under the container type, we've got build. And what build allows you to do is to create a new container from a Dockerfile build. And so the way that looks is you essentially grab, say, a directory on your host that's got a Docker file and the other files that you need, that context that you need, and then you just invoke this. So client container build, and with that content that has a Docker file in it. And that just works. In this case, we're getting it from a Git repo. So this kind of like Git integration is another example of some of the extended things that we have within the Dagger framework. They're a lot easier than just sometimes working with a plain old Docker file. If we go back and we look at, say, the Node.js SDK, similar thing here. You can jump in here, look at container, and you can find build within here. So everything's very consistent across the different SDKs. Now, additionally, I'll mention that if we go back one here, there's also a really, really convenient way of doing this with directory. So say you're reading in your host's, a source directory, and then that's the thing that has the Docker file in that. Then the other one you're going to want to watch out for is this one right here, Docker build. So Docker build will build again from that directory. So let's see what that looks like in a little bit of code. Let me pull in my Visual Studio Code here. Let's see where that guy is at here. Boom, sharing that. Okay, so here's now a Python example. Very, very similar, right? So if we look right here, we've got that directory approach that I just highlighted, right? So we got from the client host directory, getting the current directory, and running a Docker build. If we take a look in here, and this is running in this context right here in this test CI Python here, I've got a Docker file. It's super simple. Mine just says from Alpine 3. But let's go ahead and run this so we can see what happens. So running this here, we get our Docker build, and what we ran inside of that container that we built was after we built it, we added with exec and we ran uname -a, and we get all this beautiful stuff that pertains to that Alpine type container that we built. Whereas I'm running on a Darwin machine, right, on a Mac. You can get the same kind of effect if we switch this around and we do this approach, right? Where we do container build and we feed in a directory. Again, that same directory, in this case, my client host at dot, right, the present directory. So then if I run that, you can see that this is going to run exactly the same way. We get that same uname -a output right there. So this kind of just, I noticed that some people just didn't realize this is there. So imagine this could be used. If you've got a bunch of Docker files, you need to keep them. You need to just pull them in and execute them and create a container and then go from there. Once you have that container in hand, of course, you can do whatever you want. You can add more execs. You can take that container and trick it out, right? Add your own entry point on there, what have you, right? So it's very much up to you. Now, the other approach would be to say, okay, great. I know I can use Docker files now. That's great. But I kind of want to get away from my Docker files. I want to pull them into Dagger. And that could be that you've either got, maybe they're really simple to convert over, or they're super gnarly and they've been hard for you to maintain. And so you really want to get them into something that's real code that you can run tests on, that you can maintain, you can get more members of your crew working on as well, because it'll be in a language that they actually understand, right? At a certain level, everybody understands Docker files, but beyond that, it can get pretty crazy. So luckily, we have an excellent blog post that talks all about that. And I'm going to bring that up right now. So let's bring this guy up here. I'm just going to share my whole screen. And this is actually one that was done. Let's bring this guy up here. We'll go to the docs page again so you can kind of see it from the beginning. So from the docs page, it's right now living in the Go SDK guides. So if you go down in here, you'll see this guide here about replacing your Docker file with Go. If you go to our blog site, you also see there's a blog post that gives a high level of this and then leads into this technical overview here. So this shows you the approach, and the way to think about it is you want to essentially take your existing Docker file and you want to break it down. So the way to think about it is break it down into the components that you have and then figure out how to map those over into Dagger. So one way of thinking about that, I'll kind of put this up here, is you can kind of start to think of a table. And as I was thinking about this talk, I was like, oh, we should actually have a table like this. So once we get this in a good state, we'll actually share this out. But the idea being that some of the constructs that you're really familiar with in the Docker file have this similar construct over in Dagger, right? So at the top of that Docker file that I showed you, it just said from Alpine 3, very common, right, to show what your base image is. Similarly, if you're in a particular SDK, I'm going to highlight the Python SDK for no special reason. You could see something like this, container from, you'll see this funny underscore because from is a special keyword in Python. So we've got a from with an underscore in Python only, but all the other SDKs, you'll just see something more like from, and then Alpine 3. Copy, run, env, workdir, all have equivalent type constructs that you'll see within Dagger. Now, the other thing to think about is there's a lot of things in Dagger that you can do that don't map neatly to something you would get from a Docker file. So sometimes you want to think a little bit about the functionality. Some of it is actually a lot what you'd be doing in, say, a command line Docker build with options or Docker run with options. So for example, if you're mounting cache mounts or mounting a directory or providing a build arg or something like that, those are things that are more akin to stuff that you might be doing outside of your Docker file today and having to drive via a script. But with Dagger, you can bring all of that in at once. So the way to take a look at that is, again, choose your SDK of choice. Let's flip over here to Go again. And as you go in, and you'll notice these overall headings. So client is for dealing with the client, getting things from the host, for example, or creating files or directories. But if we go down here to container, you're going to see a lot of those constructs that you think of when you're thinking about converting your Docker file. And a lot of these that you're going to use are going to be some of these that are down here that start with. So if we see things like in here, with default args, with a directory. So take a container that I have and return that same container, but now with a directory attached to it, or with a new entry point specified, with an environment variable, with a secret, with a workdir set to a new workdir, right? With a label. And there's even some withouts. So if you have an environment variable that you want to drop from here, or you have, so maybe you've used a Docker file, it had a bunch of envs in there already, but you want to remove one of those and have a new image, a new container to work with that has those, you can do that as well. So as you start thinking about this, kind of your first thought is, okay, what do I want to do overall? Can I break this down, logically, maybe not be bound by the existing constructs you have? And then take a look and see what's under this container type and see what's there that could be useful to you. And then go over and take a look at some of the existing documentation. So when you look at the example that we have about replacing a Docker file with Go, it'll kind of take you through this process, and you'll be able to see how some of those things translate into some of the things that we actually have here in the example. So in this example, you see here some of the concept that we've talked about already. So we're working with a memcached container that we're building here, and you can see we get client container from a particular version of Alpine, and then we execute things inside of that container to add groups and users, install some packages, add some environment variables here, and then you can move on from there. And in this case, we're actually then invoking some additional functions. So we've actually been able to kind of group things up into functions as well. Some of the advantage of doing this in an actual programming language. And you can see what some of those things are down here. Like we've actually created functions to set our dependencies or download memcached or what have you, right? And so you can kind of package those things up. And so again, reimagine something that might be kind of a gnarly Docker file today and think about it in those components that are way more useful for you to think about. So, in conclusion, whether you're working with existing Docker files that you need to keep around, and so you want to be doing something something, you know, in essence like this, where you want to be running a Docker build essentially from your Dagger code. Totally possible, works great. Go ahead, go for it, use it, and then layer on top of that all the other Dagger goodness that exists today. Or if you want to translate what you have in Dockerfiles over into Dagger, you can see that you've got really a superset, quite a big superset of the functionality that you have in a Dockerfile with Dagger, because you've got all the power of the Dagger engine, as well as all the constructs from your particular programming language of choice to bring to the table. Okay, that's it. Go out there and make it happen. Thanks so much.